Preface. This work must not be misinterpreted into an attack upon the Hebrew race. That its undeviating title may presuppose such a condition, the author feels certain. That the author intends to reflect the slightest personal or historical discredit upon this peculiar people, he emphatically denies. It is the duty of history to chronicle events and incidents connecting with individuals or nationalities which create events, without the slightest suggestion of favor, fear, or suspicion. Cicero, the Roman, said, "It is the first and fundamental law of history that it should neither dare to say anything that is false, nor fear to say anything that is true, nor give any just suspicion of favor or disaffection." What is written here is based on the author's unprejudiced researches among historians who have both favored and criticized the Jews as a race and their principal historical characters as individuals. The Jew has had high place in the history of the world. He has figured in the military, political, social, religious enterprises of almost every country. He has been characteristically nomadic, going from place to place, and taking active part in the affairs of state everywhere, but building no kingdom of his own. From the earliest days of the race, when Menes, said by some to have been from the loins of Ham, while accredited as the offspring of Shem by equally eminent historians, first occupied the throne of Egypt, to the days when Joseph formed the first money, stock, and land trust by effecting a corner on all the food products of Egypt's fertile country, and requiring of his Jewish brethren their lands, money, and, in many instances, their families as remuneration to Pharaoh. Even to the days of the modern Rothschilds, the Jews have been prominent in the conduct of state in nearly every nation. Abraham was everywhere, counseling with the monarchs of nations through which he migrated, and he not infrequently found it to his advantage to juggle the truth, which he unhesitatingly did not on 2 occasions to save himself from the unpleasantness of being put to death. We find Ezra, a scribe of Moses, exercising great authority under Cyrus when he was king of Persia. Daniel had already served uninterruptedly as Babylon's prime minister for the remarkable space of 65 years when Darius, with his ally Cyrus, destroyed the kingdom of Babylon and promoted Daniel to even higher place of state by making him chief of 3 presidents, to whom he had distributed the government of his great empire. The history of Egypt began and ended with Hebrew blood in control, and we find the Jews vacillating between the high place and the penitentiary in almost every instance. Joseph's impetuosity got him into jail in Egypt. The courtiers of Darius threw Daniel into the den of lions, although their predecessors had previously engaged him in a still more effective test of personal courage by having thrown him into a fiery furnace whence he had escaped unharmed. When Ahasuerus, ruler from India even to Ethiopia, with his own 127 provinces, was on his throne in Shushan, he grew a little too merry under the mellowing influences of his wine feast, and commanded his voluptuous Vashti to appear before the company of princes he was dining, that they, too, might observe her ravishing charms. We are told that, because she also, having entertained the noble women of the realm until the pleasantries had flown to her head, and not being inclined to yield to her merry-making lord, refused peremptorily to come into him, she was disposed from her regional title, and a certain Jew, Mordecai, a Benjamite, for whom a hangman's scaffold was within the month to be erected, worked his way into the graces of Ahasuerus, and dictated the selection of a kindred Jewess, Esther. That this Jew accomplished his purposes with the characteristic Hebrew skill and diplomacy is evident from the haste with which the royal monarch forgot his beauteous Vashti, and speedily gave her things. And, as it is further said, the king loved Esther above all the women, which was a very unique compliment and distinction, as he had a splendid assortment always on hand, and Vashti was regarded as incomparable in charms. Mordecai was not long in being called the place of uncompromising rival, Haman, as a chief adviser to the king, and he celebrated his authority by hanging the blundering Haman on the scaffold Haman had so cheerfully constructed for the elusive Jew. And so the history goes. For those who perceive a difference in the capabilities of the Negro as compared with the Jew, the author recommends a more extensive study of the conditions of the Negro than may be procured from observations of the American Negro alone. Indolence, shiftlessness, and their concurrent ill qualities are results of climatic conditions, not of traits of blood. Besides, the American Negro has but lately emerged from slavery. He has known only the soil, while his more fortunate kinsman, the Jew, has from his early nomadic disposition acquired the languages and arts of the traveler and tradesman, and has trafficked in merchandise where his wits have been more sharpened. What the author claims in this work is, not that the Jew is inferior, nor does he wish to impute to the Jewish race any of those objectionable traits claimed by the Caucasian to be found in the Negro type of humanity. Subjects of ethnology must be considered above racial prejudices. The ethnologist, like the laws which govern nature, must be no respecter of persons. Whatever may be the claim of predetermined historians as to the Negro, we must consider him as a race rather than an individual tribe or community. Besides, it is not a fair parallel to draw to study the Jew and the Negro in comparison alone with the American Negro. The best examples of the author's contention are found directly in northeastern Africa, where they have dwelt in their native originality and simplicity of custom, habits, etc., since the days when Ethiopians first governed imperial Egypt. The effort of the author is to prove herein by evidence from history showing the intermingling of the Jewish race with those of other races, and these, in turn, with still other races, together forming a miscellaneous intermingling of racial affinities, that the Jew of today, as well as his ancestors in other times, is the kinsman and descendant of the Negro, holding the Negro's features and characteristics through the long years of racial transmutations, and I might add, in spite of the Jewish intermarriages into other races, which fact is so thoroughly established by history, an impartial authority of international repute, one of the greatest in the world, as an anthropologist and ethnologist, recently wrote the author, "As for the Jew, there is one man, Dr. Maurice Fishberg of New York, himself a Jew, who has been making a splendid study of his race, sociologically and ethnically. His articles appear mostly in Popular Science Monthly, edited by Professor J. McKean Kettle of Columbia University. His conclusions as to racial affinities are startling but true, and prove to be so. The Jew in psyche is the same as the races among which he lives. He is broad-headed among broad-headed races, Russia, and long-headed among long-headed, Africa and Spain. There is no modern Jewish race. Intermarriage causes this, and the Jew type disappears if there ever was one. In Russia, I am told by a Jew, it was customary to disinherit the firstborn because of the prime noctis custom. Hence this alone brought new blood in. The rabbi in this city is from northern Germany, as is a typical blonde Aryan. Jews in Algeria are of the Mediterranean race. They have long ceased to be a people and have become a religious sect, and they desert their religion whenever they can because they are no longer adjusted to it. Religions are ethnic matters, after all, is said, so they tend to become allied to the church of the people among whom they live when they have liberty to do so. Originally, they were a small piece of the Semitic-speaking people, and there is some evidence that the whole Mediterranean basin, or at least much of it, was Semitic before the Aryans came down. There is also some evidence of a relation between the Hamitic and Semitic languages, proving that the two are sisters of the same parents, and the parent was the great Mediterranean race, which includes Arabs, Egyptians, Berbers, ancient Spaniards, Ligurians, Pelasians, and all the other tribes living around the Mediterranean. Now, for the early affinity of the Negro, the best book, I guess, is that of Professor G. Sergi of University of Rome, The Mediterranean Race. An English translation is published in New York, I think by Macmillan. He proves what many another anthropologist has done before, namely, that all the long-headed types in Africa and Europe are closely related. The head shape is identical, or nearly so, from the Negro to the Scandinavian, and there is a perfect gradation of complexion and other characters, from the little black broad-nosed Negro to the big white narrow-nosed Scandinavian. The broadheads in Europe are all intruders from Asia. I do not agree with him that this race, Euro-African, arose in Africa and spread north, but the opposite is the truth. Nor do I agree with him that the original Aryans were the broad-headed Asiatic invaders. The weight of evidence is to the effect that the original Aryan was the blond part of this Euro-African race which was cooped up in the north. The original Semites were those which spread around the Mediterranean, probably on the northern and eastern shores. The Hamites were, then, an early offshoot in Africa. It is but a step from the Berber and Egyptian to the Sandinese, and from these to the true Negro. All these types are first cousins from Scandinavia, all the way to Congo. The original Jews were, therefore, short, dark people of the long-headed type. The original Jew and Negro were, then, descended from the same father. The evidence of intermarriage you mention is a universal phenomenon, and the close affinity between Hamitic and Semitic speech and between the northern Hamitic people and the Semites show close relationship, as you surmise. Anthropologists distinguish numerous types in Africa, which you group together as Hamitic. I think the term Hamitic should refer only to the northern ones, part of the Mediterranean race, and have so used the term. These are the conclusions to which I have come. By the way, the same Mediterranean race, I find, has survived in India, where it has early percolated. The Brahmin caste seems to be very pure, but the lower castes are more or less broad-headed Asiatic aborigines. Aryans are all gone, only their speech being left as evidence that they once conquered the land. It would be better to say that the Negro descended from the ancient Jewish type or Mediterranean race. It is hardly correct, ethnically, to reverse the sentence. Discovery of fire. We learn from the profane history of Phoenicia, by Sancho Niato, that, shortly after the flood, the art of generating fire was discovered by accidentally rubbing pieces of wood against each other. This enabled the sons of Noah to scatter about and to go into the mountains to live, as previous to this time. They were compelled to dwell in sections where tropical climate supplied them with food and bodily warmth. The influence of this discovery on the civilization and development of humanity can hardly be estimated. Man originally lived in the tropics only. He knew nothing of clothing or artificial heat, ate none of the oily, heat-bearing substances such as meat, fish, etc., and subsisted alone on fruit. His discovery of fire enabled him to eat fish and fowl, and with these he could live anywhere. He could be independent of climate. As he found heat, he discovered he could eat many of the foods of the earth which he had not otherwise tried. Animals were killed and cooked, and the art of treatment of various cooked foods was developed. As men found they could eat certain foods found in the woods by cooking them, they began to gather in places to cultivate these foods. Hence we have cities, agriculture, society, invention and commerce, directly due to fire. As men lived together, they found residences were needed, whence came our buildings. Then as they found they could materially modify foods by cooking them, they also tested fire on iron, steel, etc., and thus discovered the manufacture of steel and iron implements. This made possible tools and other implements, and with these men learned of other inventions and conveniences by steadily improving those they utilized. It was a step to discover that the application of personal attention to the growing grains improved their quality and quantity, and when men discovered they could make steel and iron pliable by heat, they shaped plows and other instruments, which they used for the cultivation of the corn, wheat, and other products of the fields, and this gave farms, and as they needed more space, as the human family grew in numbers, they cleared off the land, and communities of interest brought farmers close together until mutual societies were formed, social intercourse resulted, and mutual laws determined upon for protection and advantage. Hence, from the savagery of original lawlessness to the milder conditions of barbarity, and from that to civilization, may be traced to the accidental discovery of fire. Races of mankind. One of America's most reputable authorities says that distinctions in form, color, and physiognomy divide the human species into three great types or races, known as the black, Ethiopian or Negro, the yellow, Turanian or Mongolian, and the white, Caucasian. These races subdivided themselves into numerous families and peoples. We must not suppose each of these three types to be sharply marked off from the others. They shade into one another by insensible gradations, thus passing from the temperate regions of northern Africa to the tropical countries of the interior of that continent. We find the different tribes encountered exhibiting a chromatic scale that embraces all the shades of color. This is sufficient reply to those who claim the superiority of the Jews to the Negroes because of their occasional lighter color. We know that those race characteristics to which we have referred, though capable of being greatly modified by climate and the varying conditions of life, are very persistent. There has been no perceptible change in the great types during historic times. The paintings upon the oldest Egyptian monuments show us that at the dawn of history, about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, the principal races were as distinctly marked as now, each bearing its racial badge of color and physiognomy. As early as the times of Jeremiah, the permanency of physical characteristics had passed into the proverb, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin?" On account of this persistent character of form, complexion, and physiognomy, these physical distinctions form a better basis of classification than language, for migrations and conquests often result in peoples giving up their own and adopting a foreign tongue while at the same time retaining all their physical peculiarities. To efface these requires a great lapse of time. Thus, the Jews have in general adopted the language of the different peoples among whom they have found a home. The Hebrew physiognomy is as marked today as it was 3,000 years ago. The author uses almost the exact words of this celebrated authority. There has been found a likeness in the Egyptian and Jewish codes that has occasioned a comparison of certain parts of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, leading great historians to the belief that Moses but copied them bodily for his laws. There is certainly a very close agreement, says Rawlinson, between the moral law of the Egyptians and the precepts of the Decalogue. How the Jews were naked. It might not be amiss to tell here how the Jews came to be called Jews. The reputed founder of the Jewish race, as a race, was Abraham, the son of Terah, and 10th in lineal descent from Noah, to whom the right of primogeniture belonged. The title of Jews was not given them until after the Babylonish captivity, when the tribe of Judah became the most considerable, and almost the whole of what was left of Israel. The first name that was given to Abraham and his children was that of Hebrews, which some derive from Heber, the 5th in descent from Noah. But it is hardly probable that Abraham would call himself by his name, rather than by that of any of his 10 predecessors, and the author is of the opinion that it was given him by the Canaanites, because he came thither from the other side of the Euphrates. The word Heber signifying in the original the other side, whether of a river or any other thing. However, after Jacob had received the name Israel, they preferred that of Israelites to the name Hebrews, who the Semites are. We must not confuse the word Semitic with the word Hebrew, used for a very small Semitic tribe which became isolated or pocketed on the eastern Mediterranean shore and the interior valleys, a tribe which was very backward, being barbarous for thousands of years while great Semitic civilizations grew up in Egypt and around the Mediterranean and in Asia Minor. They even knew nothing of writing until the 7th century B.C. Nor should we mistake the word Jew, which now refers solely to that religion evolved about 600 B.C. by Ezra and the other Hebrews in their Babylonish captivity, and after they were released by their conquerors. The Hebrew Jews were wonderful proselytes and made converts in many other Semitic lands, so that by the time of St. Paul they had synagogues in Egypt, northern Africa, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor, indeed wherever Semites lived. Later they proselytized among the Asiatic broadheads, and to such an extent that the present Jewish people are in most part descendants from Asiatic converts, while the Christian and Mohammedan religions claim a great number of the Semites. Origin of man and the flood. Many amusing conjectures are advanced respecting the location of the Garden of Eden. To anthropologists, the chief interest lies in establishing the racial tendency of the first man. The author is hardly ready to believe that the earth's surface was materially affected by the flood. To believe the entire face of nature was broken up is ridiculous. Certainly there were changes wrought by the immense inundations, and time has doubtless covered the original Garden of Eden many fathoms deep beneath the dust and the sands of ages. But, whatever may be our individual views, it is hardly probable the ark had floated very far away, considering its dimensions and its having no method of propulsion, from the original site of its creation when the rain subsided and the ark rested on Mount Ararat. The fact that the dove was able to return to the ark with the olive branch proves conclusively that the earth had retained its usual physical conditions, minus, of course, the great loss of carnal life, which succumbed to the destructive elements. What we are most concerned to know, then, is not so much where the Garden of Eden was, as to what manner of man was the original inhabitant of the Garden of Eden, and his sons down to Noah. Accepting the computations of almost all the earlier historians, there certainly were living in the time of Noah grandchildren of persons who had known Adam and heard from our first father the story of the Garden of Eden. As letters had not been invented, and tradition was man's only history in those times, and since Noah survived the deluge, we are able to conduct traditional history carefully through the earlier development of the human family down to the bright era when writing was invented to preserve the doings of mankind. It would seem probable, then, that had there been any material change in nature wrought by the deluge, or had the Garden of Eden been far remote from the resting spot on the ark, Noah was past 600 years old when he came from the ark, and when we recognize the longevity of the antediluvians, it is not improbable that he knew even some of the intimate family of Adam. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912, Enos 905, Canaan 910, Malaleel 895, Jared 962, Enoch was translated at 365, Methuselah was 969, and Lamech, Noah's father, 777 years old. Nor let us think that these years were not equal with our present years in point of time, with the possible exception of 4 or 5 days. We know that the early method of computing time was sidereal, and the old calendar as found by Caesar in Egypt was almost identical with our own. It must be conceded that, taking into consideration the longevity of people in the antediluvian days, there must have been, at the time of the flood, a great many more people on earth than even today, as so many were born and so few died before arriving at ripe old age. When we know that mankind generally doubles itself about every 36 years, we are ready to agree with Mr. Whiston that the earth had, at the time of the deluge, the enormous population of more than 100,000 millions. For the benefit of those students of longevity who may wish to pursue this phase more deeply, the author begs to introduce here the opinion of the ancient historians that the antediluvian year was an absolute space of time nearly equal to our present and ancient lunar one, and only about 10 days shorter, or to be precise, 10 days, 1 hour and 28 minutes, and 1/2 shorter than our present solar year. Yet it contained 360 antediluvian days, which were equal to only 355 days, 4 hours, and about 20 minutes of our present days. The Earth's diurnal motion having been retarded, and our days consequently lengthened in that proportion partly by the quantity of foreign matter derived from the comet at the deluge, which God is believed to have sent to participate in the general physical upheaval which the Earth underwent at that time. The Mosaic Law distinguished 4 sorts of years. 1. The civil, according to which all political matters were regulated, consisting of 12 solar, and afterwards lunar, months. 2. The sacred, which began in the month of Nisan, or March, which was the 7th of the civil year, and regulated the order of all their religious ceremonies. 3. The sabbatic, or 7th year, and 4. The Jubilee, or 50th year, which was kept at the end of 7 weeks of years. It is plain by the calculation which Moses gives of the days of the flood, see Genesis chapter 7 and 8 and elsewhere, that the year consisted of 365 days, and consequently of 12 solar months, the last of which consisted of 35 days. It is probable, too, that Moses, having been brought up in Egypt, had learned that way of reckoning from them, because they are generally believed to have been the first inventors of it. The author does not agree with Scaliger and others after him who suppose that while this method of reckoning must have been that of the Israelites, still they had an intercalary month once in 60 years, as the Scriptures hint at no such intercalation, or year of 13 months. In Exodus 12:2, we find that Moses, by direct command of God, computed the years after that period by moons. We know from Herodotus that the Egyptians, from their remarkable knowledge of astronomy, which he credits them to have perfected, adjusted the length of their year to the annual revolution of the sun by adding to their 12 months of 30 days each 5 additional days in 6 hours, while the Greeks and Romans used the more rude and inconvenient form of lunar years, intercalating a month every 3rd year. In short, we have reason to believe that but little difference has occurred in the length of the year, and the only material changes in the calendar may be credited to Caesar, with Augustus' intervention in planning innovations in the computation of the leap year, and afterwards to Pope Gregory, who made only slight modifications, none of these affecting the length of the actual year. But this digression is immaterial to the subject of this work. Mr. Whiston believed that the air and general climatic conditions were different before the flood than after it, and the effect on human bodies as well as on the productions of the earth. But he thinks the purity and equality of the antediluvian air were the natural and regular properties of an original earth such as one would rationally expect in a world newly come out of the hands of its creator, and such as the generality of our fellow planets, as far as we can observe, are supposed to have at first and hitherto retained. He supposes that a comet which he believes to have caused the deluge, and God may have utilized this natural means of executing his omnipotent will, in passing by the earth, by its attraction accelerated the earth's annual motion, and changed its then circular orbit into an ellipsis, and that the earth, at the deluge, carried off vast quantities of the gross, heterogeneous, and indigested masses with which the chaotic atmosphere of the comet was crowded, part of which were received into our air, and the other part being mixed with the waters derived from the comet, settled and formed a new crust over the surface of the earth in some places. These 2 great changes in the natural world would have very considerable consequences. That made in the earth's orbit would, by placing us at a greater distance from the sun, occasion a very sensible decrease in the heat of that luminary, which must, on calculation, have been a 25th part greater before the flood than since. Whiston made this calculation. It is evident that the primogenial soil would lie buried under the sediment, for the author does not believe the substratum of the earth was changed. There is always a heavy sediment following protracted floods, even where no matter is supplied by atmospheric commotions, such as the above-mentioned comet. And Whiston believes the crust of the earth thus formed would be about 505 feet thick, and it is reasonable that the fertile mold of the original earth would be much thinner spread in such sediment, and consequently, with other things, such as the dampening of the heats of the earth's center, the earth after the deluge could be nothing near so fruitful and luxuriant in her productions as the antediluvian earth was. This supposition of a new earth acquired by the earth after the flood may, by the way, also account for the phenomena of bones, teeth and shells of fish, and other marine and vegetable productions so frequently dug up even on mountains and at great distances from the sea. The heterogeneous composition of our present gross atmosphere, acquired likewise from the comet, must necessarily occasion great irregularities and deprivations in the temperature and constitution of the air. For the difference of climates being not wholly due to the sun's heat or the nature of the air, but partly to those caloric and frigorific mixtures which are uncertainly contained therein, and our air being now in the torrid zone, full of sulphurous and sultry, and in the frigid ones, of nitrous and freezing, effluvia or exhalations, which may be removed on the veering of the winds from one region to another. Those extremities of heat and cold and sudden changes of which we are now so sensible are thence easily accounted for, and we may very well credit our meteors, thunder, lightning, clouds, rain, winds and storms so common with us, and of which the pure homogeneous antediluvian air was perfectly free, to those same mixtures and exhalations. Thus we are fully convinced that the deluge, while it may have wrought physiological and atmospheric changes, left no geographical differences on the earth, and that our first parents, being inhabitants of a perpetually tropical country in the land whence have emanated our dark races, and living to such advanced years, must have become themselves blacks, if climatic conditions alone were accountable for the nigrescence in mankind. Before setting aside the subject of the creation of man, let us take some notice of the opinion of those who think that mankind was in being before Adam, who was the progenitor of the Jews only. To support this, they allege that Moses makes mention of two distinct creations, one of mankind in general, and the other of Adam and Eve. Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, and again Genesis 2 verse 7. And in the progress of his history gives strong intimations that there were several more men in the world when they were created. Else it is not easy to be conceived how Cain could be a tiller of the ground, which much presuppose all the artificers that have relation to tillage. Nor can his going into another country, marrying a wife, and building a city be otherwise accounted for. From which they would infer that Moses intended only to give an account of the origin of the Jews, and not of the primitive parents of the whole human race. These objections are easily answered, for the passage wherein the creation of man is mentioned a second time is plainly no more than a recapitulation of what had been said before of the creation of the world in general, with a more particular detail of that of our first parents. And as to the numbers of men supposed to be in the world about the time of the murder of Abel, it is by no means improbable that these should be descendants of Adam and Eve, whose posterity, in the space of near 130 years, for it was in that year of Adam's age that Seth, who was given in lieu of Abel, was born, might, by a fair calculation, be multiplied to many thousand souls, considering the primitive fecundity, and that none is supposed to have died in the interim. But the most plausible objection to the pre-Adamites is that if Adam and Eve be allowed to be the progenitors of all mankind, there can be no tolerable cause assigned of the difference in color between the whites and blacks, it being very improbable that they were the offspring of the same parents. To this it may be answered that the variety of complexions in the world may be rationally accounted for in another way. We know how the air and color of men's bodies differ according to the climate they inhabit and their greater or lesser distance from the sun. We may therefore well conclude that the first colony which settled in a very hot country received a great change in their complexion proportionable to the heat of the climate, and became very tawny, gradually inclining to blackness as the sun was more intense upon them. Hence, in a generation or two, that high degree of tawniness might become natural and at length the pride of the natives. The men might begin to value themselves upon this complexion, and the women to affect them the better for it, so that their love for their husbands and daily conversation with them might have a considerable influence upon the fruit of their wombs, and make each child grow blacker and blacker, according to the fancy and imaginations of the mother, the force of which is evident from many instances. Upon this supposition, the children thus produced must, every birth, approach nearer to an absolute blackness, and as their tender bodies came to be exposed naked, as the manner of such countries is, to the violent heat of the sun, their skin must needs be scorched in an extraordinary manner, and perhaps its very texture altered, and by that means contract a blackness far superior to that of their parents. By such degree, it is not improbable that people of the fairest complexion, when removed into a very hot climate, may, in a few generations, become perfectly black. As to what some have imagined that this blackness was supernatural, and a judgment inflicted upon Ham, the son of Noah, for discovering his father's nakedness, and that all the people of that complexion are the progeny of that undutiful son, this seems very unlikely and without foundation. The curse on that occasion being laid on Canaan, the son of Ham, by name, and yet his posterity are allowed not to have been black. If we admit that Ham's posterity were the blacks, we must take into consideration two features of the Hamitic and Semitic life, which gives us the reason for finding in the modern Jews the features with a much less coloring of the Africans. History shows that the Jews, while always a migratory race, spent their first years in Egypt and other parts of Africa, many being born there, and, as the author shows in this work, many the interbred descendants of the Hamitic and Semitic families. The Hamitic races, having remained stationary in Egypt, as history shows, continued as the survivals of the fittest for that region, to grow more and more black, while their Jewish brothers, removing into less tropical zones, in time lost some of their tawniness, and grew more and more into the appearance of the white man. But no climatic transmigration could remove the facial A and other characteristic peculiar to those two people. Curse of Ham.